It's well known that some animals are known to attack humans if threatened, injured, or protecting their young. But every so often, rare and chilling cases where animals have transcended mere instincts and become real-life serial killers who seemingly target humans specifically. There are animals who have killed more people than even the most notorious human murderers. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we'll go over 3 of the worst animal serial killers to ever walk the earth. Welcome to Final Affliction. Around the turn of the 20th century, in the Kanchanpur district of western Nepal, a young man set out from his village into the jungle, armed with a decrepit old muzzle loader, while towing a goat. He had built a tiger hunting stand, where he tied the goat to an earthed pen and mounted it onto a tree, lying in wait for the majestic Bengal tiger. Hours elapsed, and by the time the sun was setting over the horizon, his initial excitement of hunting a tiger had turned to boredom and irritation. Dusk was fast approaching, but still the scrawny goat stood tethered and untouched. He began to doubt if the tiger would show up at all. But then it happened. The tiger gracefully appeared with a force unlike any he had ever seen. It attacked the goat with appalling power, which was a big contrast to its beauty. It was as if the dappled patterns of the forest floor themselves had come alive and possessed it. The goat had no time to neither cry nor move. One moment it was alive, and the next it was gone. The young man's mission was suddenly called to question. To him, the notion of shooting the tiger felt impossibly bold. It was as if he was assassinating a king and not just a mere animal. He noted how massive it was in size, with its eyes more similar to his than any other creature he had ever encountered. He watched as 2 cubs playfully appeared from behind the trees looking for their mother. This only soured his conviction further, but he had to make a decision, to shoot or not to shoot. With the tigress in his sight, he took one deep breath and then pulled the trigger. The tigress dropped the goat and dashed back into the forest with the taste of its own blood filling her mouth. The cubs hesitated for a moment before obediently following her. The bullet had broken the tigress's upper and lower canine on the right side of its mouth. However, in pulling the trigger, the young man had unknowingly created a monster. In 1903, the indigenous Taru woodcutters, herders, and farmers harvesting grass for their livestock started disappearing. They would venture into the vast Nepalese jungle and vanish without a trace. The Bengal tigress had begun its revenge without warning. Soon enough, it went on a hunting spree, bringing entire villages of western Nepal to their knees. It attacked with stunning speeds, snapping necks with its powerful jaws as its razor-sharp claws pinned down and shredded the victim's flesh. What began as rustling in the tall grass or a whisper of padded feet would end with an explosion of primal savagery that would be over in seconds. From men and women to even children, the soon-to-be famous beast made the locals prisoners in their own homes. Normally, Bengal tigers don't kill or eat humans. They are semi-nocturnal predators that fear humans and will generally change direction at the first sight of man rather than confronting him. However, this lone tigress had developed a rather startling behavior of not only losing its inborn fear of man, but also hunting him. It had ceased behaving like a tigress, prowling around villages and stalking humans in broad daylight. With a broken pair of canines, it meant that she was unable to hunt her usual prey and had found an easier meal that was slow and unable to defend itself: humans. The locals were there for the taking. The villagers decided that if anyone was going into the jungle, they had to be in groups. But this didn't help. The elusive tigress was smart enough to only strike when one wandered off alone, dismembering their body parts as it tore them to pieces, leaving nothing but their tattered, bloody clothes. The attacks became so frequent that the locals thought there was more than one tigress attacking them. Soon enough, the beast had racked up an insane number of victims, nearing 200 people. This birthed its name, Champawat, which translates to the destroyer of man. The best hunters among the villagers organized hunting parties to kill the man-eater, but she was a professional in hiding and staying clear of their traps and paths. She was much more cunning and intelligent than any tigress they had ever hunted. With the rising death toll, the Nepalese government intervened and sent in the army. The soldiers made several attempts to corner and capture or kill the tigress, but were also unsuccessful. However, before they could declare their mission failed, they had one last trick up their sleeves. They gathered a massive hunting party consisting of hunters mounted on elephants, local volunteers, and the soldiers themselves, and together formed a vast line, which they were to use and drive the devil of Champawat out of its hideout. The line then pushed through the jungle using the ancient Nepalese ring hunt method and slowly closed in on the tigress like a massive pincer. The tigress was overwhelmed by the collective thunder of 100 rifles firing, thousands of men screaming, and dozens of elephants blasting their trumpets into the air. With its last hope of survival being to run in the opposite direction, it dashed into the Sharda River and crossed over, seeking refuge in the neighboring country, India. They had successfully forced the tigress out of Nepal. The Nepalese government then called off the army, given that it was no longer their problem. However, in its new territory, the tigress moved on to feast on the villagers of Kumaon, India. It had tasted blood and was hungry for more. Hunters, as well as the local authorities, hunted for the beast, but just like before, she was always one step ahead. The man-eater was always on the move, traveling long distances at night, and seldomly stayed near a kill site for more than a few days. She went on a rampage, operating with almost supernatural efficacy from one Indian village to another. She grabbed any human, irrespective of the time of day, and dragged them deep into the jungle, where she would devour them. By 1907, her known victims had went up from 200 to over 400 in numbers. It was then that the Indian government paid a courtesy call to Jim Corbett, who was an expert marksman and a master tracker, to help kill the tigress. At first, Jim was reluctant, but eventually agreed, but only on two conditions. The first was that all the soldiers and hunters who were already in pursuit of the tigress were to be called off, because he didn't want to risk being shot by a stray bullet. And the second, that the government had to withdraw all the existing bounties on the tigress. This was because the bounties had led to the killing of more than 1,000 innocent tigers while in pursuit of the man-eating tigress. Both of his conditions were met, and he leapt into action. He recruited 6 other Kumaoni men for the hunt, and they set out for Pali just as news arrived that the tigress had struck again. Traveling light and moving fast, the men marched on foot, passing over hills and valleys, with none having an idea of the horrors that awaited them on the other side. On the 3rd of May, 1907, the men entered the village of Pali, but they felt as though they were in a ghost town. The central courtyard was bare, and the stone huts were silent. It was like an abandoned village, not a soul outside. Something terrible had happened here. For 5 days, the villagers had not gone beyond their own doorsteps and were in a state of abject terror. In the next 3 days, Jim and his men patrolled the dense forest near Pali, but when the tigress failed to show up, they concluded that it must have shifted its hunting ground to the nearby village, Champawat. Early the next morning, they set out toward the village. They arrived just immediately after it had dragged a 16-year-old girl collecting firewood into the forest. The men followed the blood trail leading into a ravine. They found bone splinters, a human leg still trickling warm blood, and her skirt along the trail of carnage. The irrefutable evidence of horror was saddening and sickening, and the Champawat tiger was nowhere to be seen. The next day, with the help of the local volunteers who flashed out the tigress, Jim Corbett fired 3 shots from his double-barreled black powder rifle, bringing the tigress's 7 years of terror to an end. He had accomplished that which was deemed all but impossible. The tigress was paraded in the surrounding villages, and they couldn't help but notice how smaller and less imposing it was now than when alive. Celebrations followed and went deep into the night, with the sound of jubilant songs filling the air. A closer examination of Champawat's carcass revealed that it had tattered canines which had left it helpless in defending its hunting ground against other tigers. This in turn had forced it to venture into the human settlements. Additionally, the humans had raised the jungles for timber and farmlands, driving the tigers and their usual prey out of their habitats. The Champawat tiger's attacks were listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the highest number of human fatalities from a tiger. At the time of her death, the tigress had devoured 436 souls, not counting livestock and wild game. This number is believed to be more than any other individual killer, man or animal, before or even in years to come. Some described her as the most prolific serial killer of human life the world had ever seen. When you hear the name sloth bear, you probably think of quite a docile, lazy creature who takes its time getting from place to place. But despite its name, these bears are nothing like the creatures they are named after. The only thing that these bears and sloths have in common are their unusually large claws. But how they use them differs completely, as some unfortunate people found out back in 1957. Mysore, otherwise known as Mysuru, is a city in the southern Indian state of Karnataka. It is the 3rd most populous and 3rd largest city in the state, and is one of the cleanest cities in India. Situated at the foothills of the Chamundi Hills, Mysore is a city that is surrounded by nature and beauty. One of the creatures who lives in the forest surrounding the city are sloth bears. Usually quite an introverted species, sloth bears prefer to stay away from humans as much as possible. Like most other wild animals, these bears see humans as dangerous and prefer to keep their distance. However, every now and then, something will happen which causes a seemingly normal animal to act completely abnormal. This is what happened to one sloth bear in 1957. The story happened in a small village in the Nagvara Hills, 105 miles northwest of Bangalore in Mysore State. A sloth bear had made its home amongst the numerous boulder-strewn hillocks which surrounded the village. From these hills, the roughly 100-kilogram bear would venture down to the surrounding fields of the village, where it would then forage for food. Usually, sloth bears are quite solitary creatures. Their main diet consists of foraged fruits and nuts, along with termites and ants. They are able to locate these tiny creatures by smell, as they have extremely powerful noses which can detect insects up to 3 meters underground. Upon finding a mound of tiny critters, the bears will scrape at the structure with their 4-inch claws until they are able to get to the center of the ant or termite hill. They then suck the insects up through their muzzle. Considering the normal diet of these animals, it came as a shock to everyone in the village when they discovered that someone had been severely mauled by one of these creatures. The man had simply been out in the forest, foraging for some fruit, when he stumbled across the sloth bear. The animal had also been out trying to gather some food to eat. However, it was badly startled when the villager came across its path. Unfortunately, though, instead of running away from the man, the bear began to attack him instead. Angry at being disturbed, the bear charged at the villager, It rose up on its hind legs and slashed at the unprepared man with its massive claws. Terrified and unsure as to whether he should run away or not, the villager was hit in the face by the animal's claws, causing him to lose an eye. Just as the bear was about to finish him off, the villager was able to scramble to his feet and take off into the forest. The bear followed after him, but due to the denseness of the trees and foliage, the man was able to make his escape. Limping back to the village, it was there that he told the rest of the villagers what had happened and warned them to be careful if they ventured into the forest. But not everyone heeded the man's warning. Thinking that he was making a big deal over nothing, a few other villagers ventured out into the forest in order to cut down some trees. A few hours later, only one of the villagers returned, and he wasn't in good condition. He was covered in blood, and his face had been partially torn off. Despite this, he was the lucky one out of his group of friends, as the others had not survived at all. In fact, when the villagers sent a search party out to find their remains, they were horrified to see that some of them had even been partially eaten by the bear. The attacks continued like this for a few weeks, with people falling victim to the angry sloth bear fairly frequently. However, things finally came to a head after one fateful attack. Alam Bux was an elderly Muslim who lived in a shrine situated between the cities of Arskere and Shimoga with his 22-year-old son. One evening, his son had decided to go out for a walk to get some fresh air. He had been walking his usual route through the forest when he accidentally stumbled upon the infamous Mysore sloth bear. The animal had been foraging for figs in a small field, but as soon as it noticed the 22-year-old at the edge of the field, it immediately began to attack. The bear charged at the unprepared man, growling as it descended upon him. The young man tried his hardest to get away, but the bear was simply too ferocious. Due to the fact that it had killed people before and had gotten away with it, the bear had lost all fear of humans. It began tearing into the young man with no care as to what happened to him. The animal clawed and bit at the man's face, inflicting so much damage that there was no chance for the villager to escape. The young man eventually succumbed to his injuries and passed away. Having finished with its attack, the sloth bear ambled its way out of the clearing and back into the forest. It was a few hours later when Alam began to get worried. His son had been out far longer than he usually was, so the older man decided to go and search for him. Sadly, when he came across the site of the attack, he was heartbroken at what he saw. Lying in the grass, covered in wounds, was his son. Devastated, Alam knew that things couldn't continue as they were. He wanted revenge for his son, but most importantly, he wanted to make sure that no one else ever had to suffer the tragedy of losing someone they loved to the beast. With this in mind, Alam reached out to a friend of his, a hunter by the name of Kenneth Anderson. Thinking that the hunt would be relatively easy, Anderson packed lightly. All that he took with him was an electric torch and a .405 Winchester rifle and a single change of clothes. Arriving at Alam's shrine early in the evening, Anderson wanted to get the hunt over and done with as quickly as he could. He planned to wait until nightfall, when the bear would be more active. Starting his search near the fig trees where Alam's son had been attacked, Anderson then ventured out another 1.5 miles, trying to locate the bear. However, he did not come across the creature during his walk. He stopped at another little clearing where he hoped the bear might forage, but after having no luck there either, he returned to the shrine. The next day, Anderson ventured out into the forest once again to find the dangerous sloth bear and put an end to its rampage. He was taken to the mouth of what locals thought was the bear's cave. However, after throwing rocks into the cave and receiving no reaction, Anderson returned to Alam once again. He told the elderly man that he was not able to stay any longer, but to contact him by telegram should the bear attack again. Only 1 month later, the sloth bear of Mysore attacked once again. 2 woodcutters who had been out in the forest were seriously mauled by the infamous sloth bear, as it was disturbed by their actions of chopping down trees. With a sudden ferocity, the bear charged at the 2 men, slashing with its long claws and biting at them with its sharp teeth. Whilst the first woodcutter was able to escape, even with injuries, the second woodcutter's injuries were simply too fatal, and he passed away. After discovering the two men, the district forest officer of the area contacted Kenneth Anderson again. They wanted the bear dealt with as soon as possible. After receiving the message, Anderson requested for the exact coordinates of where the bear was last seen. He was determined to get the bear and put a stop to the attacks. It took 10 days for the coordinates to come through, which annoyed Anderson as he worried that the bear could have moved on by then. However, the hunter was still determined to catch the bear. He traveled to the hillock, which was 3 miles from the nearest town. Along with the hillock, there was a nearby lake called the Iankara. It was here that it was discovered that the bear had attacked another person, a forest guard who had been doing a simple patrol. Setting forth with a rifle, a torch, and a few helpers, Anderson traveled 6 miles into the jungle. Earlier that day, a man had approached Anderson, telling him that his brother had been attacked by the bear. It took an hour and a half of trekking before Anderson finally stumbled upon the injured man. He had heard the man's pained moans and found him unconscious at the bottom of a tree. Knowing that he couldn't just leave the man on the floor, Anderson picked him up and began to carry him back to the village. Sadly, he only got a short distance before twisting his ankle. This meant that there was no way for Anderson to save the man, and he ended up passing away. Anderson was later found by forest officials, who took him back to the hospital. He stayed in the hospital for a week before he was released. During his time in the hospital, the bear attacked 2 more people along Iankara Lake. Finally, having enough, Anderson resumed his hunt. The hunter ended up camping out near some fields where the bear had been spotted roaming. Anderson waited from 5 p.m. until 11 p.m. before the infamous sloth bear made its appearance. Eventually, the animal ambled out of the forest, and Anderson was able to line it up in the sights of his rifle. Taking a deep breath, the hunter squeezed his trigger and finally put an end to the bear's reign of terror. At the end of the ordeal, the Mysore sloth bear had killed at least 12 people and mauled over 24 others. The reason why the bear suddenly went on such a deadly rampage is still unknown to this day. Some believe that the bear was a male who had once abducted a young girl from a nearby village to be his mate. However, she was rescued by the villagers, which some people believe angered the bear. Another theory was that the bear was actually female and that she was enacting her revenge on humans after having her 2 cubs stolen from her. But this was disproven once Anderson confirmed the bear to be a male. Whatever the reason for the bear's actions, the people of Mysore were glad to be rid of the beast. They felt much safer with the animal gone. And whilst it is always sad to end the life of an animal, sometimes it is to prevent even more people from meeting their terrifying final affliction.
John Henry Patterson arrived in Mombasa, British East Africa on March 1, 1898. He was greeted by the magnificent fortress, Fort Jesus, built to protect the city's residents. After all, Mombasa connected the rivers to the Indian Ocean, allowing anyone controlling the vital port to have influence and power over maritime trade. Unsurprisingly, the beautiful port had a bloody history. It was captured and recaptured by the Portuguese and the sultans throughout the 1600s, changing hands at least 9 times. In 1895, the British finally bought Fort Jesus and were keen on keeping it that way. They decided to build a 1,000-kilometer railway across the land, starting at Mombasa all the way to Busha in 1896. This was the reason Patterson, a lieutenant colonel in the British Army known for his fearlessness and competence, was sent there. He was commissioned by the London-based Uganda Railway Committee to ensure the British investment was going as planned. After spending nearly a week in Mombasa, the anxious Patterson finally received marching orders in the form of a letter instructing him to oversee the construction of a bridge over the Savo River. Ideally, he would see its completion before the railway was completed from the opposite end. Patterson rode the train out of Mombasa and was immediately love-struck by the lush vegetation surrounding the area. However, upon entering the Taru Desert, the environment drastically shifted into something desolate, dead even. Perhaps it was a foreshadowing of the darkness to come. Patterson arrived at Tsavo by sunset the following day. From a distance, he could see the 8,000 Indian laborers encamped 7 miles out from the unfinished railway's end. Within the same evening, the first attacks happened. When Patterson first heard about the reports of a lion attack, he completely dismissed it. After all, the railroad workers were paid handsomely, and many had years' worth of Indian rupees in their possession. Consequently, Patterson suspected the missing worker was murdered by his fellows and subsequently thrown into the wilderness since there was no corpse. However, this all changed after a terrifying incident. One of the first few people Patterson met in Tsavo was an officer named Singh, an Indian warrior contracted to protect the railroad workers from various threats. One morning, a frantic man woke Patterson up from his tent, telling him that an enormous lion had mauled and seized Singh. Immediately, Patterson grabbed his rifle and ran to where this supposedly happened. Although the lion was not there any longer, all of Patterson's suspicions were instantly dispelled. The lion's paw prints lay visible in the sand, and Patterson noted that they were still fresh. Meanwhile, Singh's heels painted desperate furrows into the sand, mapping the direction towards absolute darkness where he was taken. Patterson asked one of the workmen who witnessed everything. According to the man, as he slept beside Singh inside the tent, the beast reared its devilish head into the door. The lion looked at the man, paralyzing him with fear, and then decided to maul the unfortunate warrior by the throat. Though Singh desperately cried out, he was no match for the powerful jaws of the frenzied creature. The man inside the tent could do nothing else but listen to Singh's whimpers from outside. Patterson decided to track the creature, and he was met with a gruesome spectacle not long after. The blood-soaked ground revealed Singh's body, or more precisely, what was left of it. Pieces of flesh lay on the ground along with the larger bones the lion couldn't have eaten. Singh's head had holes punctured by the lion's vicious teeth. His eyes were wide open the entire time. Upon closer inspection, Patterson realized there must have been 2 lions, since the tear marks on the body indicated a tug-of-war. Patterson collected the remains and buried them underneath some stones. However, he took the head back to camp for identification for the medical officer. Afterward, Patterson traced the lions further along the river. However, the tracks eventually disappeared when the soft sand met hard, rocky ground. Gazing in the distance, Patterson vowed to eliminate the beasts. Patterson's first attempt at hunting the lions happened that same evening. He sat in a tree close to Singh's tent, hoping the lions somehow acquired a taste for humans and decided to return for more victims. Some terrified workers followed and pleaded to sit with him. However, the rest remained in their closed tents. Shortly after, a series of sinister roars alarmed Patterson. The lions were back on the hunt. Being an experienced tiger hunter, Patterson knew it was a waiting game. He sat for 2 hours in total silence, hoping to finally bag the beasts. However, screams from another camp half a mile away filled the evening air. The lions had seized another victim. A poor bloke was dragged from his tent and mauled to death. Soon, Patterson attempted again to thwart the attacks by positioning himself up a tree near the latest victim's tent. However, screams from another area filled him with bitter disappointment. The sneaky devils had eluded Patterson once again and took another worker somewhere else. This turned into a game of cat and mouse where the lions were always one step ahead of Patterson. He attempted to find them during the day, but stalking 2 lions in the thick jungle of Tsavo was a fool's game, as the beasts had every advantage over the hunter. However, Patterson did not give up. He crawled, stalked, and carefully searched for the 2 beasts in the hopes of coming upon their lair. Unfortunately, it was to no avail. The lions continued seizing workers from their tents. As soon as Patterson successfully traced them towards the river, the footprints would always disappear when the sand met the rocky ground. It was as if the lions knew they would lose Patterson at that exact spot. Eventually, the lions grew bolder and more determined, attacking and seizing workers behind thick fences or even around campfires. The beasts timed their attacks so well that the workers began to believe they weren't beasts at all, but the devil himself. The lions were afraid of nothing. At one point, while Patterson was sleeping, he was awoken by movement outside of his tent. He shouted, "Who's there?" But nobody answered, so he went back to sleep. To his dread, he found footprints around the tent in the morning. Recognizing his luck, Patterson moved to a sturdier hut made from palm leaves and boughs. He surrounded the area with thorn fences positioned at a substantial height. Consequently, the worker tents were also covered by thorn fences. However, the lions still found a way to jump over or break through the barrier and seize another worker at night. The killings became so regular, men were taken from their tents every few nights. In one instance, the lions were prowling again in the dark. Some terrified workers pleaded with Patterson to let them into his quarters. He willingly did, only to realize the workers left a man alone in their tent. Patterson decided to take a few men and return to fetch the poor bloke. However, upon their arrival, they discovered the man had already died from shock after being left alone at the lions' mercy. Eventually, as the attacks mounted, the workers began fleeing from Tsavo, and the construction of the bridge was halted entirely. Consequently, colonial officials began to intervene. However, they too experienced the might of these devilish creatures. Patterson attempted to eliminate the lions many times, even preparing a trap that would use the workers as bait. However, the lions escaped unscathed for some unknown reason, leading some workers to believe the creatures were indeed devils. However, Patterson's luck soon changed. Following a botched attempt when his gun misfired, Patterson propped a wooden stage some 10 feet away from a donkey's carcass, previously killed by one of the lions. At 12 feet high, Patterson waited patiently during the night. Suddenly, one of the lions began stalking Patterson instead of the dead donkey. The creature edged nearer and nearer, and eventually, Patterson could make out the lion's form. He let loose a shot, and a terrifying roar pierced through the air. Hearing the pained creature struggle, Patterson followed through with multiple shots. Finally, the growls subsided into deep sighs and halted completely. Patterson had exorcised the devil. A few weeks later, he used the same method, and although the second lion was harder to kill, Patterson managed to bring the beast down. It took him 6 shots to finish the job. The Tsavo man-eaters were no more. The construction crew returned to the site and finished the bridge on February 1899. Although the exact number of people eaten by the lions remains unknown, Patterson recounts the figure to be around 135. Patterson turned the infamous creatures into flat-skin rug mounts for 20 years before selling them to the owner of Field Museum. To this day, the lions can be observed in the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, Illinois. Although once believed to be the devils in animal form, the maneless lions will forever be remembered as vicious beasts living in the dark pages of Uganda Railway's history. And although we're the most intelligent creatures on Earth, we must remember that once we leave our protective bubble, we're still at the mercy of nature, always under the watchful eye of the apex predators that lurk within them, waiting for their moment to pounce and bring you to your final affliction.